commitment to Judaism and raise the level of discourse by drawing not only on local experts in their respective fields, but also from well-known teachers in the tri-state area and beyond. CCE will also create energy and excitement in and around the school with robust programming and foster a greater love of learning among members of the greater community. Again, welcome, and it's now my pleasure to introduce Michael Feldstein.
Thank you all for joining us tonight. I have the honor and the privilege of introducing our two distinguished panelists. Rabbi Gil Perl is currently the head of school at Kohelet Yeshiva in Philadelphia. Before that, he served for 7 years as the dean of the Margolin Hebrew Academy, Feinstein Yeshiva of the South in Memphis, and he was also an instructor of modern Jewish history at Yeshiva University and the associate head of school at Yeshiva University's High School for Boys. Rabbi Perl earned his bachelor's degree from the University of Pennsylvania, his master's and PhD in Near Eastern languages and civilizations from Harvard, and his rabbinical ordination from Yeshiva University. As a teaching fellow at Harvard, Rabbi Perl was twice awarded Harvard's prestigious Certificate of Distinction in Teaching. And in the spring of 2006, he was named Yeshiva University's Lillian F. and William L. Silber Professor of the Year. Rabbi Perl writes and lectures widely on topics relating to the history of modern Jewry and contemporary Jewish education. He is the author of the book, The Pillar of Volozhin, Rabbi Naftali Tzvi Yehuda Berlin, and the World of 19th Century Lithuanian Torah Scholarship. And he is the go-to person on anything and everything related to the Netziv. Rabbi Tully Harczstark is the founding principal of SAR High School. He received his BA from Yeshiva College, his smicha from RIETS, and his MA in Jewish history from the Bernard Revel Graduate School. He previously served as the rabbi of Congregation Keter Torah in Teaneck, New Jersey, and is the associate principal of Judaic Studies at SAR Academy for 9 years. In 2017, Rabbi Harczstark received the Covenant Foundation Award for Excellence in Education. Rabbi Harczstark is also the co-founder of Davar, a unique learning community in Teaneck. The format for the panel will be as follows. Each panelist will speak for approximately 20 to 25 minutes on a focused area of the topic, modern orthodoxy in a postmodern era. They will have 3 to 5 minutes each to respond to one another and to sum up their talk. And at the end, we will have some time for some questions. And if you do have a question, what we'd like you to do is to direct your question in the chat area to Rabbi Tzvi Bernstein, who is the moderator. Do it in the chat function, please, and he will be handling the Q&A after the program. So without further ado, let's start the program. Why don't we go ahead?
I think that's my cue. Thank you, Michael. It's truly a pleasure to be here this evening. I want to applaud the efforts of the Center for Community Education. I think it's truly a wonderful initiative and a tremendous addition to the Stanford community and to the modern Orthodox community as well. So yeah, share kochachem to all of you who've been involved on that front. And I also want to say that it's a pleasure to be doing this together with Rabbi Harczstark, who I consider both a friend and a mentor. And so I'm very much looking forward to the conversation this evening. As you heard, at least in part from the bio that was perhaps a bit too elaborate a few moments ago, I consider myself to be very much a product of the modern Orthodox community in the modern Orthodox world. And I don't take that for granted. I appreciate it deeply. And I see that as very much a big part of creating and shaping who I am today. And the truth of the matter is, it really wasn't until I took my first position as a head of school where I was responsible for educating other more modern Orthodox children, or for passing on the legacy of what we call modern Orthodoxy, that I first began to have some serious questions about what we might call the project of modern Orthodoxy, what exactly it is, what exactly I was supposed to be doing as having been entrusted with the job of teaching this or passing this on to the next generation. And the questions really began almost 15 years ago at this point, when what was very much on the forefront of many parents' minds, certainly at the parents of high school students, about 10 again to 15 years ago in the modern Orthodox community, was the phenomenon that was often referred to as flipping out. And the flipping out phenomenon took two different forms. There was the more talked about form, which was the form where the young man who was perhaps marginally passionate about his Judaism in high school goes to a yeshiva in Israel, finds his black hat and his jacket, and never looks back. And there's the other form of flipping out, though, which was perhaps less talked about, which was the young man who perhaps even was rather attached to his Judaism in high school, and then lands up on a college campus, perhaps even after a year in Israel, and there loses his tefillin and or his yarmulke, never again to look back. And obviously it happened just as frequently amongst women as it did amongst young men. But this was the fear of flipping out, and this was what I was hearing from many parents. This was what was on my mind, and it raised the question for me as to why. Right? Why was it that we were seeing what seemed like a large number, a proportionally large number of young men and women who were coming through our educational systems, coming through our community and community structures, who were opting for a different path, either, should we say, to the right or to the left, as they were entering into young adulthood. And the more I thought about it, the more I became convinced that at least one of the major factors in this phenomenon was what I considered to be, or what I sensed was a lack of passion in the modern Orthodox community. And this feeling that there was that we were somehow lacking in passion. And by passion, I don't mean we didn't have passionate people in the modern Orthodox community. I meant that we lacked a passion for modern Orthodoxy. And that even that phrase together, passionate modern Orthodoxy, sounded almost oxymoronic. We had a hard time even imagining what exactly that looked like. You know, what did passionate modern Orthodoxy mean somebody, you know, who really shuckled very hard during their silent Amida, you know, and then read Plato's Republic as the Chazan was repeating Shemona Esrei? It was unclear to us, you know, what exactly passionate modern Orthodoxy was or even looked like. And my feeling was that much of the lack of passion stemmed from a lack of ideology. That in our community, we didn't quite know what modern Orthodoxy was, what it was supposed to be, what are we supposed to believe in as modern Orthodox Jews, what separates us, not by default, but de facto, from other streams of Judaism or even other sub-denominations within Orthodoxy. And it was really at that point that I began to think that if there was an ideology within the modern Orthodox community, that ideology was to some degree out of reach or perhaps even irrelevant to way too many of the young people that I was now responsible for teaching and for reaching. That the vision that had been outlined by the intellectual architects of modern Orthodoxy in the 20th century, by Rav Soloveitchik, by Rabbi Lamb, by Rav Lichtenstein, who was my teacher, simply wasn't reaching and wasn't doing it for the young people that were in my school and other schools that looked like mine, save for the most intellectually gifted. It just, the reality was that they weren't being energized or they weren't being inspired by the ways in which Milton's poetry or Kant's philosophy or Kierkegaard's theology could enrich and enhance their quest to become a ben or a bat Torah. In fact, it was Rav Lichtenstein himself who in the late 90s wrote, or perhaps quipped, but he put it in writing, that the American modern Orthodox community that he saw was, and this is a quote, one in which the Rambam frequently does not so much compete with Michelangelo as with Michael Jordan, or even lamentably Michael Jackson. And indeed, if there was one overriding message that I thought we were giving to our young people in the modern Orthodox community, if there was one message we were sending as to what modern Orthodoxy was about, it was about moderation in all things. A little bit of this and a little bit of that, a little bit of orthodoxy, but not too much, a little bit of secular culture, but not too much. And all too often, an ideology of moderation was becoming an ideology of mediocrity. And mediocrity is not the stuff upon which passion is built. It was about the same time that I began to think about a concept that the best-selling business author, Jim Collins, had coined when thinking about businesses, and particularly businesses that made this leap from what he called good to great. And thinking that some of what he began to outline in a business context may actually be very, very relevant to this problem that I was seeing in our religious context, and specifically in the context of Orthodox Judaism. Jim Collins coined this term called a hedgehog concept, which was based on an essay by the preeminent philosopher of the 20th century, Isaiah Berlin. And the idea of a hedgehog concept was as follows. He wrote that these businesses that could make this leap from good to great, businesses that really were outstanding and leaders in their field, were businesses that had at their core a central idea, concept, or mission around which all of their resource engines revolved. Something which the entire business, entire organization could align itself, which didn't mean they only did one thing or only had one product, but everything they did all came back to this kind of central mission, this central idea that was at the core and the heart of their business. And I began thinking about that in the context of orthodoxy in general, and had the following thought that when I looked around at other sub-denominations of orthodoxy, it seemed to me that other sub-denominations, and from an outsider's perspective, other sub-denominations that seem to be having more success, not complete success, but more success, raising young people to follow in the footsteps of their ideology, were sub-denominations that had for lack of a better term, a hedgehog concept. Now, in a religious context, or at least in an Orthodox Jewish concept, to me, the hedgehog concept meant an authentic Torah value or mitzvah that was at the core and the center of their community's ideology, and which they believed they did better than anybody else in the world. And I forgot, that was a critical piece of Jim Collins's definition as well. A hedgehog concept is not only something that's at the center of your business, but something you believe you do better than anybody else in the world. And I looked around at other sub-denominations of Orthodoxy, and that's what I saw. I saw in each community there was a mitzvah. There was an authentic Torah value that was at the heart of each of these communities, which didn't mean they didn't do the other 612. Of course they did. But there was one that they elevated above the rest, and to which the rest of the resource engines in their community seemed to align. So, for example, in the yeshiva world, that's an easy one, right? What is the one mitzvah that's at the core and the heart of the yeshiva world? It's Talmud Torah. Right? In everything that happens in that community, every institution, every organization, their educational institutions, the marriage market, everything in that community orients itself towards the promotion of Talmud Torah. And if that's true about the yeshiva world, we look to the Dati Leumi world in Israel, and there too, you have one mitzvah which rises above the rest, and that's the mitzvah of Yishuv Eretz Yisrael, of settling the land of Israel. And there too, everything they do ripples out from there, which doesn't mean that they don't keep Shabbos. Of course they do. But there's one mitzvah they believe they do better than anybody else in the world. And quite honestly, for all of us who are sitting right in various places in the United States, they're doing it better than we are. Right? And this is at the core of their ideology. In Hasidus, in general, the Hasidic world, they have a concept called Dveikus. The Chabad world, we know what their hedgehog concept is, right? It's kiruv, right? Which doesn't mean, again, that they don't keep kosher. Of course they do. But there's one mitzvah, one Torah value that rises above the rest. And these types of hedgehog concepts seem to me to be quite effective in inspiring a sense of passion, in building the type of sense of fervor for a continuation of a particular lifestyle that we seem to be missing in the Orthodox world. It seemed to me that modern Orthodoxy was missing a hedgehog. Now, before you unmute yourselves and start screaming at me, Torah Umada, I'll tell you, I also thought, right, and considered the possibility that Torah Umada was in fact, or is in fact, the hedgehog concept of modern Orthodoxy. But here too, all sorts of questions came to my mind. Like, for example, is Torah Umada even a mitzvah? Is it? I mean, are we sure that it's what God wants from us? And if so, how do we know? From where? I actually, the first time I raised this concept of the need for a hedgehog concept for modern Orthodoxy, I was expecting this response. I gave it at an Orthodox forum, an organization that used to gather at Yeshiva University, bringing various thinkers in the Jewish community together to talk about a certain idea. And I presented this paper, and somebody asked me this question, right? What about Torah Umada? And I was fortunate enough that before I could answer, sitting a few seats away from me at the time was Rabbi Norman Lamb, who literally wrote the book on Torah Umada, who responded instead of me. He said that actually Torah Umada is not an ideology, it's a pedagogy. It's not an end. It's not something we strive towards. It's something we use to become Ovdei Hashem, to arrive at a greater understanding of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. It's a means, it's not an end. And even if it is, or was intended to be the hedgehog concept of modern Orthodoxy, I would come back and tell you again that at the end of the day, that my feeling was this was only accessible to a very, very small group, right, of my most intellectually gifted, most intellectually curious young men and women. And that left an entire population, 90%, I would say, of my school population, for whom modern Orthodoxy was not going to be Michelangelo, but was going to be Michael Jordan or Michael Jackson. And so it was there that I began to argue that we as a modern Orthodox community, if we are going to inspire passion, if we are going to be able to give this over to a next generation, we needed a hedgehog concept of our own. That's where I ended my first foray into this particular topic. And I kind of pressed pause, hoping others would step up and perhaps fill in the next step as to what that hedgehog might be. It didn't happen. And so a few years later, with nobody else entering that space, I threw out an idea that I thought perhaps could potentially be the hedgehog concept for modern Orthodox. Now I'll tell you what it is, and with that I'll hand things over to Rabbi Harczstark. I'll begin by saying that I wrote in 2 essays. You can find them on the Lehrhaus, theLehrhaus.com, I think is the website. They're 2 lengthy essays, but I began by stating that I thought in order to find the hedgehog concept, in order to identify the hedgehog concept for modern Orthodoxy, 4 criteria were necessary. Number 1, whatever it was that became this hedgehog concept, or that emerged as this hedgehog concept, needed to be an authentic Torah value. It needed to be something that all streams of Orthodoxy and perhaps all streams of Judaism recognized as part of the divine will, even if their community didn't choose to highlight it. Number 2, it needed to capitalize on modern Orthodoxy's unique positioning at the intersection of religious and secular, isolation and immersion, fidelity to the past, and faith in the future. It needed to take advantage of where modern Orthodoxy uniquely was situated in our larger society. That was number 2. Number 3, it needed to be something which was transcendent. Shatnez is a wonderful mitzvah, but it wasn't going to work as the hedgehog for modern Orthodoxy. It needed to be something that would provide fertile ground for intellectual exploration, for theological exploration, for something that could have the power to inspire. Right? It needed to be something deep, something we could sink our teeth into. And lastly, it needed to be something that had what I called pre-existing preeminence in our community, something for which there was already source material that pointed to it and said, you know what, this isn't just another mitzvah. It's a core piece of what it means to be a Jew. And based on those criteria and a whole host of sources that I brought in these essays, which you can read for yourself, I suggested that the idea of Or Lagoyim, or as I rephrase it, Or Amim, the notion which I believe was delivered as part of the Jewish mission to us at Har Sinai, that Judaism is not intended to be only an inward-looking religion, one which cares only for ourselves and for our own spiritual edification, but that Judaism is intended to better the world, not in a tikkun olam type of way necessarily, but in a way of bringing Jewish values, Jewish ideas, and putting them out there on the table for conversation, being influencers in all various different sorts of parts of the world and parts of society, that was something which is an authentic Torah value, something which we as the modern Orthodox community were uniquely positioned to do, something which was transcendent in that it could inspire, something which has pre-existing preeminence in the minds of modern Orthodox Jews, and something which perhaps most importantly could effectively reach and inspire a whole cadre of young people well beyond those only interested in the intellect, but it could reach a generation who I believe was hungry to be inspired for what was next in the world of modern Orthodoxy. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. It's really a pleasure to be here together with all of you this evening. I want to echo Rabbi Dr. Perl's appreciation, gratitude for the opportunity to be here. Thank you, Michael. Thank you to the bicultural community and to CCE. This is really a wonderful initiative, and I'm excited for this opportunity and really welcome the chance to share this space with Rabbi Dr. Perl. It's great to listen to you, and here we go. So, Rabbi Dr. Perl has framed the challenge of contemporary modern orthodoxy in an interesting and important way by seeking to articulate a hedgehog concept for our community, a big idea around which we can unite, engage with enthusiasm, and actually be the best. And that challenge to formulate a driving concept for modern orthodoxy, one that contrasts with Haredi Judaism's commitment to Talmud Torah, religious Zionist commitment to Medinat Yisrael, or Chabad's commitment to Kiruv, is a powerful formulation of the question that we must answer for ourselves. What is the driving idea of modern orthodoxy? Implicit, or actually pretty explicit in the question, is a critique of the modern Orthodox mantra of Torah Mada, a critique which I agree we must take into serious consideration. Torah Mada is a concept that is aspiring, inspiring, powerful in its highest form. But it is one that's difficult to achieve because it is elitist in the formulations that derive, for example, from the Rambam and Rabbi Soloveitchik's writings. Reading Aristotle alongside Rambam will attract a number of people, but it's difficult to shape a movement on those grounds. We must acknowledge that if an idea can't engage the range of its members, the strength and force of the group will decline, and its driving idea will become diluted. Professor Alan Brill noted this years back when he wrote in an essay that in much of American modern Orthodox suburbia, modern Orthodoxy means Torah and sports, or Torah and movies, really echoing Rabbi Perl's quoting Rav Lichtenstein, much more than it means Torah and Aristotle. So what then should be the driving force of modern Orthodoxy? So Rabbi Perl proposes the idea of Or Amim as a response to these questions. By focusing on engaging with the broader society, we can marshal the wide range of our community members, their capacities and interests and passions to make a Jewish impact on the broader world. And I applaud that goal and connect strongly to the centrality of the pasuk, Ki hi chochmatchem uvinatchem le'inei ha'amim, for that will demonstrate your wisdom and understanding in the eyes of the nations. That, as Rambam emphasized, living lives filled with Torah and mitzvot should bring Jewish inspiration to the nations around us. However, in my view, we have skipped a step, or perhaps more precisely, we're mistaking an effect for the goal. To share a Dvar Torah by way of analogy, Rav Shimon Shkup, in his introduction to Shara Yosher, quotes a midrash, commenting on our obligation to be kedoshim, to be separated or holy. The midrash says, Yachol kamoni, I might think that each of us should aspire to a godlike holiness. Talmud lomar ki kadosh ani, kedushati lema'ala mikdushatchem. God says, because I am holy, and the Midrash comments, my sanctity is higher than yours. Rav Shimon explains that since God has no personal needs and drives, he can focus solely on others, on giving. But as human beings, each of us needs to care for our own needs, but always with an understanding that such caring is in the interest of helping others, of creating a better world. Broadened out, I see the idea of Or Amim as a most positive effect of our mission, something that should guide our practical behavior, serve as a barometer to guide our learning and our curriculum design. But I believe that our primary focus should first be turned inward to our particular community and what it has to offer to clarify what we are trying to say to ourselves and to other communal conceptions of Judaism. In other words, how do we fit, and to articulate clearly to our own community where we fit amongst all these different denominations and sects and communities that now make up the Jewish community in America in particular, although also focusing worldwide. Upon examination and reflection, if we look at what the modern observant community has accomplished and how we are positioned, I think we'll find that although we are a small community and have significant areas for improvement, we have been more successful than we sometimes think, and the idea is more successful and accessible than we acknowledge. I suggest that we might not need a new hedgehog concept. Maybe what we need to do is double down and express pride on what we have been doing, articulating it with strength and confidence, sharpening rather than shifting our focus. In other words, I think that rather than develop a new hedgehog concept, we might need to take what we have and strengthen it, make it more accessible, be more passionate, confident, and determined to make it come alive. In fact, to have a little bit less hand-wringing and have a leadership that feels confident in what it is that we are trying to achieve. And a confident leadership can inspire a more confident and inspired youth. And the modern Orthodox community has a vital role to play in the future of American Judaism in particular, and of Judaism worldwide in the 21st century. This is of crucial sociological and demographic importance, and it is of intellectual and hashkafic importance as well. And I'd like to begin with sociology and demographics. I mentioned the modern Orthodoxy in the United States is small in number. The 2013 oft-quoted Pew study had it at 3% of American Jewry. While there's constant anxiety about the future of modern Orthodoxy because of its small number, with many moving further to the right on the one hand, and people going off the derech, as they say, on the other, there's also, and I really believe that this is really important to acknowledge, a natural impulse that supports the idea of modern Orthodoxy. While I know that many do not like labels, the modern Orthodox label expresses this natural impulse very well. Jews who are able, as in our contemporary American Jewish communities, to integrate and participate in the broader society have a natural impulse to be a part of and integrate into that society. While there are a substantial number of Jews who believe that we must live in enclaves in the diaspora, most Jews want to be a part of broader society to some degree. At the same time, many, although currently not most Jews, believe that Orthodox commitment to halacha is the authentic, collective Jewish expression of serving Hashem and must be maintained. Acknowledging that the desire to be part of modern or contemporary society, while also living a life of mitzvot, is a natural impulse, can allow us to be less defensive and more assertive in the importance of this claim for the Jewish continuity and flourishing of our community. Rather than be anxious about shifting numbers, we should express confidence in the mission. And it's important and necessary for us to be assertive about that impulse, as I'd like to explain. Over recent years, I have heard a number of Israeli academics describe the future of the Jewish people in the United States in the following basically similar way. There is a divide that continues to grow in America. In the liberal Jewish community, intermarriage rates have skyrocketed, halachic observance is limited, and connection to Israel is waning. The ultra-Orthodox and Hasidic communities are demographically growing in leaps and bounds as they develop their enclaves, separated both in principle and by design, from the rest of much of the Jewish community and the broader society. In 50 years, so the prediction goes, there will be two American Jewish communities, one that is barely recognizable, largely melting into the American populace, Americans who give some cultural and religious nods to their Judaism, but are not very Jewishly literate or practicing, might not even be Jewish, according to Orthodox halakha, and another Jewish community in ultra-Orthodox enclaves separated off from the rest of society. In this narrative, the American Jewish community is in overall decline and is tearing at the seams. We must resist this narrative and do all that we can to strengthen American Jewry. The intuition, the impulse to be quote unquote modern, which I don't mean in a technical sense as opposed to postmodern, but rather modern meaning contemporary, aware, connected, and also be Orthodox, is a strong intuitive impulse of members of our community and one that is very important to cultivate for the strength and continuity of Jewish life in America. And perhaps the Torah Umada hedgehog, whatever that concept is, has to do actually with nothing less than survival of Jewish community in America in a strong and healthy way. And I want to say one more thing about this sociological and demographic aspect of modern Orthodoxy. I do a lot of temperature taking of our school and of our community, probably too much of it and too often. But I do it. And when I do, I see a lot of weaknesses and failings. We're not spiritual enough. We're not observant enough. We're too materialistic, too much college pressure in our high school. We need to experience God more deeply and so on. And I think there's a lot for us to improve on. But I believe in the wisdom of crowds idea. Back in 2004, James Sorowiecki published a book by that name. In the opening story, which took place some 100 years prior, Francis Galton was surprised to find the following at a county fair. The challenge was to guess the weight of a cow, with a prize going to the closest guess. What Galton found was that the average of all the guesses was closer to the actual weight of the cow than the closest individual guess. In other words, while the individual guesses ranged widely, being over or under by large numbers, 100 pounds less or more than the actual weight, the average number of all the guesses combined was closer than the closest individual weight. 100 years later, Sorowiecki did the same with marbles in a jar and discovered the same thing. The average of all the guesses was closer than the closest individual guess. And I use this by way of analogy and not science, but that's how I experience modern Orthodoxy. It is imperfect, it is flawed, but on the simplest, most popular, non-intellectualized level, the Torah Umada of the broadest community, it expresses an intuitive impulse that will continue and is extremely important for the healthy continuity of the Jewish community in America and for its continued healthy interaction with American society, and one that we should express as a version, an aspect, maybe the core of what that impulse is. It's not only about, although it is also about an intellectual drive, but it is at its core about a way to be, a way to live, and a way to interact as Jews bringing Jews together and as Jews connecting to the world around us. And in this sense, modern Orthodoxy is not just an intellectually elitist concept. It has an important linchpin status for the healthy flourishing of our Jewish community, and we should more strongly champion that. And I just want to say again, because I feel it, very strongly, that we need to recognize that when the leadership of our modern Orthodox community is expressing anxiety and worry and concern, and that's the way that the modern Orthodox conversation goes, that has an enormous impact on kids and the next generation feeling inspired by the prospects. And if the leadership of our community would say, this is something that is spectacular, that is crucial for the continuity of our community, then the next generation would feel differently about it. And to achieve this, I think that our Frum students should be trained to achieve a better understanding of the different kinds of Jews in the United States and how to connect with them. And that's very important, and maybe even prior to figuring out how to reach out to the non-Jewish community beyond. Second, modern Orthodoxy is, of course, intellectually distinct. Torah Mada is its mantra. At SAR, we like to refer to the grand conversation between Torah and the world. And that phrase is meant to embrace the fact that the Torah that we learn shapes the way that we see the world, and that the world within which we live, the culture of a specific time and place, shapes the way that we understand the Torah. And that framing is meant to acknowledge change, that Jews have lived for centuries in the Middle East, in Africa, in Europe, in America, and each generation in each location is presented with scientific, philosophical, and cultural changes. Those challenges and questions are what makes our Torah a Torat Chaim, a living Torah, engaging the hard questions of the day with integrity, openness, and commitment to halacha. And in its, again, most common form, the question of how, whether we acknowledge changing circumstances and how we balance change and commitment is not just a highbrow idea. It is core to how we live as Jews, and acknowledging both the change and the commitment is what modern Orthodoxy is about. It means being constantly countercultural. It means valuing tradition and halacha in a postmodern world, and it means valuing science, philosophy, and culture in a traditional world. Earlier, I echoed Rabbi Perl's concern that the Torah Mada ideal is abstract, elitist, difficult to achieve, and that if it cannot engage the range of its members, the strength and the force of the group will decline and its driving idea will become diluted. In this intellectual realm, the idea is actually more accessible, and we are doing more than we think. When I was growing into adulthood, we defined modern Orthodoxy through a particular set of issues: importance of a rigorous secular studies education, view on women learning Torah, unwavering support of the state of Israel. We certainly support all three, but I think that defining Torah Mada, or the grand conversation, through specific issues is too static. In acknowledging that the world around us is constantly changing, we should define ourselves not by the issues, but by the method. The Torah and the world within which we live must speak to each other, and truth, human dignity, agency, flourishing, commitment to Torah, halacha, and Jewish continuity are all values that should drive the grand conversation between Torah and the world. When you confront the change that life brings with a commitment to truth and knowledge, Torah and halacha, and with a sense of integrity and moral judgment, that is what makes modern Orthodoxy powerful. And here, it has really made a difference. If we proudly look back, we will find that secular studies, women learning, and the state of Israel, if we look at those issues, not as definitions of modern Orthodoxy, but as examples of the method, those are three issues that challenge the observant community's thinking over the course of the second half of the 20th century. And taken in terms of the wisdom of crowds idea that I mentioned earlier in the broadest sense, we have actually navigated those issues very well, although certainly imperfectly and messily. But there's been a tremendous evolution in all of those areas, overflowing into and influencing non-modern Orthodox communities. The Haredi community supports the Jewish state in its own unique form. There are now Haredi colleges, and women's learning and teaching, those have grown exponentially, which is not to take away from the frustrations in the arena of Jewish communal leadership for women, but it is to acknowledge that on the three core issues of the modern Orthodoxy of the second half of the 20th century, we've actually done quite well. The modern Orthodox community has had a significant impact on Jewish life. We must realize that in the very daily lives that we lead, slowly, we do affect change. We build communities that can and often do show that we demonstrate the wisdom and understanding of Hashem's Torah to the eyes of the nations. Through the lives we lead, the schools we build, the shuls at the center of our communities, we make the claim that Judaism continuity and meaning, Jewish continuity and meaning depends on mitzvah observance, and that a life of Torah and mitzvah that engages the world brings wisdom and goodness to the world, with each new generation having its own questions and challenges. And today, there are other issues that are pressing. There are questions of inclusion, sexual orientation, gender diversity, disabilities, theological questions of faith and science, biblical criticism, moral questions of bioethics, immigration, healthcare, poverty. Those questions are our job to think about. Engaging these issues deeply is modern Orthodox work, and it's not simply the work of the rabbis and the professors. The broad education that our children receive empower them to engage those great issues of the day from a place of Jewish practice and a caring for humanity. And we need to embrace those challenges strongly. I guess I have two people just by way of example that have come to mind. There's Jack Lew and I hope he'll be mochel me and allow me for making reference to him, is a Riverdale resident. He's a modern Orthodox Jew who was Secretary of the Treasury from 2013 to 2017, and the director of the Office of Management and Budget under President Clinton, among numerous other achievements. And I remember when he spoke to our students and described a vote about healthcare that would affect the well-being of millions of Americans that was happening on Shabbat, and how he managed that when he was responsible for all of those lives. It's his to tell the story of how he managed it, but what I want to raise here is that the education, the values, the religious and ethical commitments that combined on that evening to be able to place him in that role as a frum Jew with that responsibility and think of the impact that that could have, that's enormous. And another example that's in my mind, just because of what we're going through during these times, Dr. Naor Bar-Zev, is a parent of ours, a pediatric infectious disease physician and a statistical epidemiologist. His research interest is in understanding how to maximize the benefit of existing and future vaccines in low-resourced, high-mortality settings, how best to protect vulnerable groups like newborns and pregnant women, and how to optimize methods to evaluate vaccine impact and effectiveness. He is, in these difficult times, a leading epidemiologist whose wisdom is of enormous importance in figuring out how to confront the pandemic. These are people who model a life of what it means to understand Jewish value, Torah, commitment to mitzvot, caring about the world, thinking about it ethically, morally, scientifically, and with care. And there are tens of thousands of us doing so every day. And I believe that we should double down on that commitment. I will conclude by saying that there's no question that we can and we should do better. Our commitment to halachic observance should be stronger. We should inspire greater passion in our children. We should bring God into our lives in new and different ways. We should learn and know more Torah than we do. But perhaps here's where the hedgehog concept, which I'm grateful to Rabbi Perl for bringing to our attention in this way and for our community, that can be an extremely helpful concept. Too often we measure our community success using actually the hedgehog concept of others. And then we consider ourselves a little bit too much of a failure. We might, in fact, not be the most spiritual or the most uniformly halachic, but by educating towards Torah or Mada or the grand conversation, whatever you want to call it, we will grow as a community that can serve as a linchpin for the American Jewish community, help Judaism respond to life's changes in a halachic manner, and bring integrity and truth to our community and beyond. Thank you.
Rabbi Perl, would you like to take the opportunity for a few minutes to respond to what Rabbi Harczstark said?
Yes, absolutely. So as expected, Rabbi Harczstark, a phenomenal presentation, compelling, coherent, cogent, and so let me respond to just a few things that were said. First of all, I absolutely agree that it is not all doom and gloom. We have much to celebrate, much to be proud of regarding where the modern Orthodox community is, how far we've come, and where we're headed, and perhaps the point which may even have been more important, that the importance of positivity amongst its leadership and the impact that can have. It probably would behoove us to make at least some mention in the weeks immediately following his passing. That Rabbi Jonathan Sachs was just such a wonderful example of exactly that. Somebody who always had such a strong positive message about Judaism and everything that he wrote and everything that he said. Getting to some of the more nuanced pieces of Rabbi Harczstark's presentation, let me respond with a few brief thoughts. First of all, the notion that by positing this hedgehog concept of Oramim, that we've skipped steps, right? Or that we've, that it should be an effect of our mission, but our primary focus should be inward, right? And we should first focus on what we have to offer. I'll never forget a Dvar Torah or a Sicha that I once heard when I was back in yeshiva, given by Rav Ezra Bick, who was talking about the curious phrase following Akedas Yitzchak, where HaKadosh Baruch Hu says, after Avraham has successfully passed the 10th and most difficult of his trials, HaKadosh Baruch Hu says, Ata yadati ki yarei Elokim ata. Now I know you're a God-fearing Jew. And all it took was sacrificing your own child. And of course he asks, how could it be? How could it be that only now God realizes? And he gave an answer that has stuck with me and that I have found play out in the educational realm over and over again. And he suggested that what was being said here and taught to us here is that we often feel like the exteriors should come last. We should first focus on our interior and the exteriors will follow. But sometimes human nature is the opposite. Sometimes we just have to do something. And by doing it, by actually engaging in it, we then we come to internalize it, that sometimes the process actually works in the reverse, that Avram actually had to do the Akedah to become an Akedah Jew. And until he did it, he wasn't quite there. He couldn't possibly internalize it until he actually had done the action. And many years ago, there was when there was lots of talk about cell phone use on Shabbos, and we were thinking about educational ways to help kids free themselves from the temptation of texting on Shabbos. And one of the ideas that we came up with was asking kids to make a public service announcement, a video for others about the impact and the power of powering down. And what we found was that by taking this message and teaching others, even if they weren't yet there themselves, even if they were still struggling with some of these issues, by challenging them to go out and do it for others and teach it to others, it actually had the effect of helping them to internalize it. And I would suggest that Oramim can do much of the same for us, that by convincing ourselves that we have something special to share, and it is our God-given mission to share it, it actually will help us work on that internal work that we need to do. Number two, I hear the Rabbi Harczstark's concept or suggestion that there is this natural impulse towards modern orthodoxy, towards engaging in broader society, and that it ought not to be something that we shun. But that scares me. That's the truth. It does scare me. Many years ago, there was a book written by a good Jew named Christian Smith called Soul Searching, about religious life of Jews, of American youth, not necessarily and primarily not of Jews. And it was there in that book that he coined this phrase, moralistic therapeutic deism. And he said that's what most kids in the United States are practicing today, moralistic therapeutic deism. It is, most of them believe that they should be good people, moralistic. They feel that religion is there to make them feel good, so it's kind of therapeutic, and they believe in a God, but they don't believe he's terribly involved in their lives, and hence the deism. Moralistic therapeutic deism. And the more I thought about it, the more I spoke to our own kids, I feel like we have much of that in our own community as well. And I'm a little bit afraid that if we put too much stock in what feels good and what feels right and the natural tendencies that we have, we're apt to land up with something that looks far more like moralistic therapeutic deism, a religion defined by each young person as what feels good to them, what seems good for them, rather than something which harkens back to Dvar Hashem and to something which we have been given down through our Mesorah. And lastly, I would raise the issue that the notion that we need to focus not on the issues but the method, that very much resonates with me. And the notion that there are big and burning questions of our time that we need to engage with, I absolutely agree with. The question though that I keep coming back to is why? Why? Why our method? Why is this the way to go about dealing with these problems, to dealing with these issues? Why engage? Why think these things through? Why use our method and not the method of Lakewood, and not the method of Breslov, or not the method of the philosophy department at Harvard? Why? Is it an accident of our birth? Is it because I happen to have been born in Stamford or Riverdale or Teaneck or Philadelphia, and I happen to have had this kind of upbringing, and that's why I approach these things as they, from this particular vantage point? I feel like we have to be able to do better. I feel like we've got to be able to give our kids something that is more powerful than just it feels natural, or it's an accident of our birth. It's the way we think about things because we happen to be in the modern Orthodox community. So at the end of the day, I don't disagree that the grand conversation is something we ought to be engaging in and we ought to be celebrating. I just feel like we need to tell, and we need to be able to tell our kids why we're engaging in this grand conversation. What is it that's bringing us to the table to have this conversation? And again, in my opinion, going back to the source material that we have, studying it, delving into the source material around this idea of Or Amim, that it's not an accident of our birth, but rather it's part and parcel of what HaKadosh Baruch Hu wants us to do. He wants us to be engaging in those. We are uniquely situated to have those conversations. If we can tell them, give them the why, then we can open the floodgates and let them and encourage them and engage in exactly that type of dialogue.
Harczstark, would you like to close the presentation portion of this program with a few comments?
Sure. I'll make a couple of. I'll try to be brief. Make a couple of comments. I guess I will start with one of the last comments that you made in terms of the Perl, about the. I can't remember exactly how you formulated it, but it brought to mind a story that a student of ours years ago made a comment that, in terms of two things I wanted to say about the natural impulse point. One is that he said that I actually think, in his words, the modern Orthodox community is still going to, when I become adult, he said, it will still be there and will still be strong, but it will be full of different people. It won't stay the same. And what he meant to say by that, I thought was a very interesting insight, which I'm just putting out there, not in direct response or in order to argue, my vantage point as opposed to yours. It's just to note that the idea of this, there is something natural about wanting to balance these two things, and it is a big challenge. And often we'll find people leaving in one direction or another because of that challenge or something that feels missing or inauthentic. But it is also striking, and I see this in our family population in school also, people who might not have been actually raised in that way. And it's not a product of, I've been raised with this and therefore I want to live this kind of life. It's actually, I'm living in a different kind of context, and I do feel and see the meaning in trying to strike this balance. So I guess that came to mind just in response to whether it's only because I'm raised this way, therefore I think that way. I find that there's something stronger about it than that. As far as the Christian Smith point, I don't think that it is the importance of the natural impulse is just to do what is natural for kids to feel like what it means to be religious, to do what feels good and what comes naturally to me. I think it's about capitalizing on that feeling and making of wanting to be connected in a certain kind of way and making the most of it. I think that our anxiety is communicated so strongly that generally kids feel like there's lots of don't, and what it means to be Jewish is, what it means to be modern Orthodox is, I'm invited to be in the world, and then there are lots of things that I'm told not to do in order to kind of keep me at bay from engaging in that world, as opposed to getting a message of how this can be an enormous contribution to community and society. So I don't think that it is just do what makes you feel comfortable. I think it's about harnessing and marshaling that impulse and making the most of it, as opposed to trying to, kind of direct it and keep it at bay. The third thing I wanted to say is that I'm actually grateful for the Or Amim idea and thinking about it. I think that one of the aspects that is sorely missing in our education is, we live in our schools in the Bronx, and as part of there are lots of schools around us which we have absolutely no understanding, no interaction. There's no space in our day. We're not prioritizing the possibility and in my gut, I feel like it's extremely important and it's not happening. And I feel like, reading your paper and this exchange just puts it back in, a sense of how important it is to engage that in a serious way. And lastly, I had mentioned that before that the rabbinic leadership and the message that the rabbinic leadership and community leadership is giving is crucially important. And I want to stress that family partnership is enormously important in this regard also, that school and family being able to partner in terms of being able to kind of generate a sense of excitement about what modern Orthodoxy is about is very important. And what I think is beautiful about this CCE initiative is exactly that. It's really the idea of community and education and communal education, parent education and kid education coming together. I think that's what makes this initiative also powerful.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to start by sort of amalgamating a number of questions that came in to what I think is driving at an issue that's got a common denominator, and that is that we call this denomination that we're talking about tonight modern Orthodoxy. And the question is if that is the term that we have been promoting for so many years, that it has to be conveying something with respect to this, to the value. And with respect to Rabbi Perl, and I think also Harczstark too, and this focus of Or Lagoyim, there's nothing really particularly modern about that concept. Indeed, it was the Navi Yeshayahu who articulated that tafkid. So what becomes essentially modern in that regard? And secondly, even just in terms of describing, bringing Torah values to the modern world, how are we different than the other denominations? And here, I just, for ease of expression, Rabbi Yehuda Parnas, the Rosh Hashiva for so many years, used to describe America into two camps. He just simplified it. There was modern Orthodoxy and traditional Orthodoxy. And let's say traditional Orthodoxy would be the world of Agudas Yisrael, and modern Orthodoxy would be the OU and the RCA and Yeshiva University. So the question is, how are we different than traditional Orthodoxy? What is it that justifies the name for us? And the questions that came in, like, for example, in terms of modern Orthodoxy, so what I mentioned, in addition to what I mentioned before, is that the traditional Orthodox world is also very modern, take advantage of many of the modern conveniences of today. And so how does, perhaps the suggestion in one of our questions here is that Rabbi Lamb's concept, or what he articulated as centrist orthodoxy, would be a better description of our religious outlook. Is that a better term? So I guess it really goes to, you've expressed very beautifully and at length as to what it means. But the question is, how are we unique? And I think, Rabbi Perl, you mentioned that that's one of the elements of the in the formulation of the hedgehog, was that it has to be something that is unique, that we do better. Right. So we'll start with Rabbi Perl.
Okay. So I would argue that what is unique and what is modern is the fact that today, by virtue of where our community is and many various historical factors that have played into the past 50 to 100 years in the American Orthodox community, we are in a position to to do, or in a way that has never been the case. It has never been the case in the history of the Jewish people. Right? And so that's what's modern about it. It isn't necessarily a different way of thinking. It's a different reality, which is today we have Orthodox Jews who can be the Undersecretary of the Treasury. We have Orthodox Jews who sit on bioethics committees of major hospitals. We have Orthodox Jews who are on a very simple level engaging in conversations with their peers at every stage of society. So what's modern about modern Orthodoxy is the opportunity to take a Torah value which we honestly could not actualize for hundreds and hundreds of years. Maybe there was a brief moment in medieval Spain where we could have come close, but outside of that, we just haven't had the opportunity to be the Or Amim that HaKadosh Baruch Hu asked us to be, wanted us to be. And so there's an exciting opportunity here in the modern, and I would say the modern diasporic community to make good on this particular Torah value. And yes, we can do it better than anybody else in the world because we uniquely sit in this on these crossroads between a deep understanding of Torah in its original texts, Torah in its in its authentic, that's probably a bad word, but it's in its traditional form, right? And the engagement with the outside world. So nobody's better positioned to do it than we are. In terms of the phrase centrist orthodoxy, look, I don't put much stock in that phrase either. I think everybody sees themselves, most people see themselves as the center. Very few people, see themselves as an extremist to one side or the other. And there's a piece of me that thinks there's something perhaps even a little elitist about the term centrist orthodoxy. But I certainly I don't think it adds anything to our understanding of what this project is.
Okay, Rabbi Harczstark.
Yes, I think this is an opportunity. I think to something that I've felt in preparing for this evening and felt throughout the evening. It's a time to say that I think that Rabbi Perl and I imagine agree on pretty much most of almost everything, I'd say, maybe a drop of a shift of emphasis. And for the sake of discussion, I think it was really important to come at it from different angles. But there's, I think, a tremendous amount of overlap and connection here. And I think it's just important to say that out loud. In terms of the labeling, I'll echo what Rabbi Perl said. The centrist orthodoxy label does not resonate with me because for exactly the same reason. I feel like everyone sees themselves as you're in the center of you're in the middle of something. Somebody's on the right and on the left where you are. And for all the reasons that I expressed in my remarks, I think that modern orthodoxy expresses something, that natural impulse, which I think is very powerful. I do not love the label, and for other reasons. I think the main reason, actually, at this time of my, in my career path after lots of years, is that I feel like the denominational labels in America are pretty destructive. I think that they might have served a purpose and been necessary at a certain point in history, but I don't feel that in the same way now. I do feel like the various experiments in Jewish living that happened over the past 200 years have, I'll just speak for, my own view, have made it very clear that it was the attempt to manage without halacha binding us. I think it feels clear to me that that's necessary in terms of how our community should function and needs to function. Orthodoxy actually counts out to me some people who are committed to living a life of halacha. Actually, they might look a little bit different. And so part of because I've increasingly come to think about this not just in the world of ideas, but in the world of how people actually live their lives, their lived lives. People who want to live observant halachic lives, and I know that that is a messy and unclear category, but still, people who live halachic lives and want to be part of the modern world should be part of this enterprise. And I feel like I've experienced in my school life cases where someone falls right within or right outside, whatever that line is that we define as modern Orthodox, based on what school you go to or what camp you send your child to, or I'll say it, like whether you're a woman who puts on tefillin or not. And I think that that's not good for our community, because I think that people who want to be committed to halacha and live in the world and figure out how to do that best, we should be kind of sharing the mission together with that group of people as strongly as possible. And that, I think, is a chisaron in terms of how the modern Orthodox label works. As far as what's unique in our community, I mean, there's a lot to say. I'll just say one thing for now. I feel like the two things that stand out for me is, one I said earlier, which is an acknowledgement of change, that the world changes, and that has to be considered in terms of how we are living our lives. I fully agree that the most Haredi or Hasidic communities, everyone is modern in that sense, and everyone has taken parts of modernity, and even if you're rejecting it, that's also modern, because that's the discourse that you are in. I think that what's unique in our community is an acknowledgement that new things come to light that weren't seen before, and that those should be taken seriously. Not that no one else thinks that way, but I think the way that we think about integrating those things in, as exemplified by the three initial categories of Medinat Yisrael, women learning, and secular studies, are all kind of new opportunities that came to light and were integrated in a careful and thoughtful kind of way. And part of that, I think, is recognizing the fullness of human experience. I feel like what modern Orthodoxy does, and part of why reading literature is important and taking in science is important, and why we think it's important to have Jewish sexual ethics classes and talk about LGBT questions in our schools, is because that's part of what's going on in life and in the world around us. And we as a community need to talk about that openly and directly, and we need to raise our children to know how to talk about those challenging questions directly and how to think about them from a Jewish perspective. And being open and embracing that, I think, is the change and the fullness of human experience, I think, are two things that I feel this community, when it's at its best, does very well.
Okay, thank you. We'll go with a final question, which goes at the issue of leadership within the modern Orthodox world, and that is the following: that to many Jews who identify as modern Orthodoxy, there's a sense that our denomination has never been as vibrant or as part of a religious movement as it was when the Rav, Rabbi Soloveitchik of blessed memory, was alive, and that in a sense, modern Orthodoxy has only been as a movement as strong as the Rav was, and that we've been outpaced by traditional Judaism ever since. And perhaps the best example of this is the Siyum Hashas that takes place every 7 years, where Giant Stadium is filled with 70,000 people, and we, as the modern Orthodox community, with other denominations, are the guests of the Aguda that really is the hosting that. And the question is, if we were to do a modern Orthodox, if it was an RCA Siyum Hashas sponsored, how big would the arena be that we would be able to bring people to? Would it be anywhere near a stadium? And so the question is twofold. One is, what are your thoughts on that premise with respect to the strength of modern Orthodoxy, postmodern, but post Rabbi Soloveitchik? And secondly, do you feel there's anyone in the Jewish world today who could fill that void of leadership and aid in the restoration of modern Orthodoxy as a vibrant movement within American Judaism? Rabbi Perl.
Am I going first again? Okay. So I want to take some of the pieces of that question and kind of separate them, or perhaps just focus on the leadership piece. I think that the example from the Siyum Hashas, I'm not sure relates necessarily to the leadership question per se. I think it raises a number of other questions as to the value of Talmud Torah and that level of commitment within our community. But I'm not sure that Siyum Hashas is necessarily the reflection of leadership. I would also say that I think that if we got to the heart of some of these other communities, of the Lakewood community, of some of the Hasidic communities, I think we would find that the sense that there's a lack of leadership, or that there's been a Yeridas Hadoros to some degree, is not something that's unique to the modern Orthodox community. I think that there are other communities that are feeling something similar. I think part of that has to do, and here we'll come back to the term postmodern. I do think it's relevant. I think we are living in a generation that has that sees authority in a different kind of way, has access to information in a different kind of way, and so leadership is going to look differently in the world that we're headed to and that our kids are headed to. So two more quick thoughts on that front. I would say that in terms of who is out there, I mean, obviously, over the past 5 years, we've you talked about Rabbi Soloveitchik, but over the past 5 years, we've lost Rabbi Lichtenstein, we've lost Rabbi Lam, we've lost Rabbi Sachs. And so if we were bereft of leadership, before, we certainly are now in the American modern Orthodox community. So the two additional points I would make is that, number one, I do think that this ties directly into some of the things that I was saying before. I think that when there is a lack of passion, a lack of enthusiasm, where we have allowed a culture or an ideology of mediocrity to kind of seep into our institutions or educational institutions, it doesn't breed the opportunity for greatness. It breeds a little bit of this and a little bit of that, and great leaders weren't formed out of a little bit of anything. In fact, I take those three. Rabbi Sachs didn't even go to a yeshiva day school. I think he went to an Anglican primary and secondary school. Rav Lichtenstein certainly didn't go to a yeshiva day school. These were people who came from other systems, and rose to the top of our community. So I would agree that there is a deficit in our leadership in our community. Again, I don't know that it is unique to the American modern Orthodox community. I think it is related to our ability to define who we are and to set our resource engines towards facilitating that. But lastly, and to note Rabbi Harczstark's, I think, really important point that we not focus on the doom and gloom. I would say that 20 years ago, when I started chiming in on this conversation about modern Orthodoxy really was an American phenomenon. There wasn't much to talk about in terms of Israeli modern Orthodoxy. But today, much of that has changed. There is perhaps the most vibrant, dynamic, intellectually dynamic, rich, intellectual sphere, right? And therefore leadership is coming today from Israel. I think that what the Tzohar organization is doing, and that many of the people involved in the Tzohar organization, Rabbi Stav, Rabbi Churlo, others, I think that they are original thinkers. I think that they don't look over their shoulder at the Haredi world in ways that many in the American community do. And I think that the result is that we're seeing all sorts of really strong, interesting, organizations that are beginning to rise in the Dati Leumi community. And I think that looking forward, that's probably where our leadership is going to come from.
Just a couple of points. I would start with to pick up on the last thing that Rabbi Perl said and emphatically agree in terms of the point of modern Orthodoxy or Tzionit Dati, whatever the term you give it in Israel. My, again, anecdotal experience, but one that I feel very strongly, is that when I remember our early days at SAR High School, and we were looking to bring teachers from Israel to America, the feeling of freshness that the Israelis felt when they came to the American modern Orthodox community was very striking. And I feel that in a short period of time, that situation has reversed itself. So I guess on some level, while I'm saying we should be positive and optimistic, I do have to acknowledge the reason to be positive and optimistic is in order to not lose a certain edge that I think we had that now is playing out differently. I think that the creative spirit that I think gives modern Orthodoxy its strength has been replaced by that kind of, in many instances, by worry and concern and limiting creative spirits. And I do think that a lot more of that type of energy is coming out of Israel right now. And I'd like for that to come back to the community here. It feels really important. The second thing, in terms of the Siyam Hashas question, the one thing I'll say is that I feel like ideally, and this is a Mashiach Zeiten kind of image in my head, our community would recognize, if we take what Rabbi Perl said seriously, each segment of this Jewish community here has a hedgehog concept that the other communities can learn from. And if this were working best, I would be comfortable saying, it's true, the Siyam Hashas actually comes from that community. And what we bring to the community is all the things that have been discussed before, and there's a tremendous power in that. And again, we should do better in learning than we do, but we each bring a certain strength, and the fullness of the Jewish community, I think, can be spectacular. That's not the way it works. It's a kind of competition of forces, and that's, I think, very unfortunate. I don't mean that in a naive, pie in the sky kind of way. I know how complicated that is. I just think it's important to kind of think that thought also. As far as the leadership vacuum, I don't know the answer to the question. I would just say, I just want to make one comment, which is to champion the idea of local work and the kind of significance of small initiatives. I think that those broad questions of who's our leader, or who's the leader and who's going to direct, those are important. But when I meet with young, with some of our alumni and their peers, 20-somethings living in the city, there's a tremendous amount of creative energy and interest and initiative to get together, to learn, we had an event in school last night, and it's remarkable actually to see the creative energy of, championing the significance of local work having an opportunity, having an impact broadly in the community, I think is really important and makes a big difference. In other words, if we each thought about in our, in Stamford and in Riverdale and in Teaneck and in Lower Merion, think about how can we be doing the best that we can be doing, it would make a big difference for all of us, and we could create a lot in that way.
Okay. I want to thank you so much, Rabbi Harczstark, Rabbi Perl. You've given us a lot to think about, and it's very provocative. The questions are rolling in. We just don't have time, but I will say that this is exactly what we hope the BCHA CCE will represent for our community. It's a starting point for us to think about these issues, and you've giving us a material and direction for which we can continue to do that. So thank you very, very much, and I'll turn it back to Michael Feldstein.
Thank you, Tzvi. Thank you to our panelists, Rabbi Perl, Rabbi Harczstark. I just also want to give a shout out to Shimi Trencher, who was our technical person who made it all work. We hope to be presenting other important programs that you'll be made aware of, and wish you all a happy Hanukkah, and thank you for joining in.